All right, well, good evening. Good. I want to welcome everyone again to our service, both those that are streaming as well as those that are here physically in the room with us. Tonight, we're going further with our history of modern Israel, and now we're in part 8, which is the World War II aftermath. Now, this and doing like the research and all that, it's really hard to kind of comprehend or put yourself, around that situation, because it's, the most bloody world war that had happened, it displaced so many different people, and just all the cleanup and all the things that going on that, it's just unbelievable, thinking through it all, and Europe, the victory in Europe came about 3 months before the victory in Japan. And so it was like even when Europe was done and started cleaning up, they still had another front on the war that was still going on, and many thought it would go on for quite some time. Fortunately, though, it was shortened. But we're going to start the story really with the Soviet Union, because at the end of World War II, the Soviets had come in from that side of the battle. And as they came in, they had their armies and occupied the territories, and they didn't, just give it back like the other Allied powers did with Western Europe. Instead, they forced the Eastern Europe into this, what they called the Eastern Bloc, a part of the Soviet Union, and forced it into a Russia-style communism. They arrested any leaders that were opposing their politics, didn't allow people to leave, and Russia had adopted the official policy of atheism, across its empire. And so they did not allow people to exercise their religion, including the Jews. They didn't allow them to practice Judaism in there. They continued many of the pogroms that they had before against the Jews, which they would limit their rights, ability to obtain property, often would incite riots, against them, especially like in Poland. And the Cold War, really started, at that time. Russia did become a nuclear power in 1949, and the Allies, knew that they were rapidly trying to get to that. But that set the stage for a lot of what was happening in Europe and a lot of the thought process, especially around Britain and to some extent the United States too. But after World War II, there was 11 million people that were displaced, that didn't have a home. And a lot of these came from Eastern Europe. As Russia was solidifying, they fled their country as well. But there's others that where the battles were fought, the homes or communities destroyed, the Holocaust survivors, a lot of the Jews that were in the labor camps or internment camps, at that time. But that's a massive, massive number of people that really didn't have any place to go. And the United States really led this effort to make what they call the displaced persons camps. They put it, throughout Europe, really, many of them in Germany, Austria, and Italy. And they were providing the food, shelter, medicine, and even set up school systems for the kids there. And just to say how it played out, in about 2 years when they were trying to find all the relatives, they had a huge number taken care of, but there were still 850,000 people in these displaced persons camps, around Europe, even 2 years later. And the last one closed in 1959. So, think about that. It's 14 years where people didn't have a home or any place to go on there. And so there was a lot of people, trying to find out how they're going to start life again. And that was in the displaced persons camps. But Britain had other concerns. In World War II, the strategic importance of oil was found. It was just such a critical element for all of their machines, the tanks and all that they had. Having control of oil was extremely important to the military. And Britain had that at the time. They controlled the Iraqi oil. They ruled Kuwait, Bahrain, and the Emirates at that time, which were all good oil-producing countries. And they didn't want to give up that strategic resource. But they're controlled by the Arabs, and they didn't want to anger the Arabs anymore. And yet a lot of the stuff that they're in Palestine, was happening. It was angering them. And so they decided to keep that 1939 white paper. That was before World War II, which limited the immigration in Israel and to 1,500 Jews going there each month. And at the time, the Haganah and other of the Jewish institutions was trying to bring a lot more. They were trying to get over 100,000 that they had waiting, that they knew, trying to get them into Israel. And there was a lot of illegal immigration, going on at that point as well, getting them in there. But Britain did their best to, keep good relations with the Arabs too, and they blockaded Palestine. They turned away 62 out of the 63 ships that was trying to dock and bring more people to Palestine at the time. And then they held their own displaced persons camp on Cyprus, the island of Cyprus, which had over 55,000 Jews. Many of them were ones that were trying to get into Palestine at the time, but they pushed them over there instead. Then the SS Exodus was probably the most famous of those ships. This was one that was carrying 4,515 Jews. They were stopped by Britain and told to go back. And so they took them to France at first, where Britain wanted to do a forced deportation of them back into France. And they refused, and France just wouldn't help. They were just like, nope, this isn't our problem. This is your problem. You deal with it. And so they finally just went back to where they came from, which was back to Germany, and dropped them off in Germany. And if you can imagine, trying to get out and bring back. But this became such an international story, just the tragedy of that whole thing, that, it really stirred up a lot of sympathy, for the Jewish plight at that time and wanting to help out or do things around that. And so this became very instrumental later too. But then going back to Palestine, at the end of World War II, population now was about 33% Jewish, and it was growing rapidly. And of course, this is, things that angered the Arabs, even more, because they wanted to limit population coming in. They wanted to, basically take over the whole thing. The Jewish population in Palestine, though, was very divided because they could see what Britain was doing, and yet they really wanted to get more of their people and get them in the right place and help them out. And so they were divided between wanting to work with the British, trying to pressure them politically, use a lot of their diplomatic skills, the things that were happening, using world opinion. And then there's another faction that was just trying to throw them out, wanted to just get rid of the British. And that was something that they had to deal with because, again, the Haganah had different things that, when trying to bring people in, they often clashed with the British authorities that was there. It's interesting, the two people mentioned there too. The first one was the first prime minister, and the second one mentioned was the sixth prime minister. So they both, got very involved in government there too. The British were still trying to reduce the violence because there was still a lot of bombings going on, a lot of the sniping, the beating up things that was still happening in that area. But they knew that they weren't really doing much to really stop the underlying causes of that. And so they basically decided just to give up and pull out. They had already, in 1946, completely left the Transjordan area, and that's where the Kingdom of Jordan was founded as its own country. And so they had pulled out of that whole section, so it's now just back in that area of Palestine. And so they pushed the problem over to the United Nations and said, we can't deal with this, you guys got to deal with it. And so the United Nations made their own subcommittee that was called the United Nations Committee on Palestine, and included people from the countries that are listed there. So they didn't have any on the main Security Council, and they didn't include Britain on there. And these guys were supposed to come together, figure out what was going on, interview the sides, and then come up with a solution for Palestine at the time. The Jewish leaders met with the committee, whilst the Arab leaders boycotted. And they boycotted because they knew, that, partition plans were going to come, and they did not want to have the Jews have any right in that area. So they were like, they shouldn't even be at the table. It should just be the Arabs. And so they boycotted it. Meanwhile, the Jewish leaders, they had a lot of inside information at the hotel. They replaced the cleaning staff with their own people that could go in there and set up microphones and all that, so that when the questionings came the next day from the different members, they had very well articulated and prepared answers for them. And so that just made the Arabs even angrier, though, when that was found out. But the committee came back, and it was a unanimous decision to end the British mandate. They all agreed that it just wasn't working, and it would not do any good to keep that thing going. And then 7 of the countries submitted what they call was the majority plan. And their call was for a 2-state partition, dividing roughly that land that was left, if you take out the Transjordan area, into a 50-50 split, on there. And it's still, again, based on the borders. The Jewish leaders accepted it, but the Arab leaders basically came back and stated that any partition that was done that would give Jews any of the land would be met with rivers of blood. And so this is really the third opportunity that they had where they could have had their own state even at that time. If they had gone to the committee, if they had talked about the things that they needed and they wanted, they would have the opportunity to have their own second then Palestinian state ready and available for them. But because of that hatred that they had toward the Jews, they lost that opportunity again. And we will pick up the founding of Israel next week.
Thank you, Joel. Very informative and interesting.